can I welcome you to one of many of CERA's fringe events we've held this time, and this session this afternoon is on the Just Transition, and in particular the work of the Just Transition Working Group and how you can be engaged and participate in that. And what I'm going to basically do is, we've all gone through loads of conference speeches and fringe events and everyone's looking a little bit shell-shocked. So what the panel have agreed is, Matt's going to just outline to us what the Just Transition Working Group is, and then I'm going to invite Alan and Matthew. Let me check, it is Matthew.
It is, two Matthews.
Two Matthews.
Fine name.
It's all right, it's me hormones. Invite Matthew and then Alan to just give a very brief introduction of themselves. And then I really want to throw it open to yourselves as to really get to the bottom of what we can do about a just transition, because it's starting to feel like there's loads of words, but loads of uncertainty as to actually what does it mean for jobs, what does it mean for lives and livelihoods. And if we're going to take the community and the country with us, then actually we need to be able to answer that. So, Matt, if you'd like to just kick us off.
Thank you for that introduction. I will try and be as brief as I possibly can, and I'm feeling a bit shell-shocked after a day of fringe events. So if I come across slightly shell-shocked, as some of you may be, from all of the goings-on, I apologise. Just to kind of run through the, I suppose, the rationale for this working group, which we got set up and running. Alan's part of, and Matthew is as well. I mean, it's just saying, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. We are very, very conscious of the need for fairness to be at the heart of decarbonisation, and for social justice to be, at the centre of our approach to everything. Not least because, and I said this in an earlier fringe today, when we were challenged as to whether Labour could oversee a just transition. I don't think we can have a transition that isn't just. Because I think if it isn't just, and we don't take people and places along with us, if we don't ensure there are tangible benefits from the green transition, and that green policy is designed in such a way as to support everyone through it, then I think it's not going to happen at the pace and scale required, and it will happen in a much more disruptive way than it needs to be. So that's the basic rationale, that the transition must be just, and we've got to design policy on that basis. We're also very conscious of the fact, and it's very much the case for the present administration, whether it's the 10-point package or whatever, that the government has not done enough, and I would almost argue successive governments haven't done enough to ensure the transition is fair and those benefits are shared. I mean, wind is a good example, I think. Wind has done incredibly well on the amount of the proportion of energy that's generated from wind, cost reduction, but on other metrics, whether it's community benefits, the amount of jobs produced, whatever it might be, I think we could have done better. And you look at countries like Denmark and others in terms of the manufacturing base that's been secured, the supply chain that's been secured. Denmark, 1 in 88 jobs is linked to wind, and it's got a population less than Yorkshire. And we've got a different situation where we've got, and BIFAB is the classic example, jackets being manufactured in other parts of the world, brought back to Scotland and installed 8 miles off the coast, and those yards going free. So when we talk about green jobs, I think they've got to be tangible. We've got to be able to explain to people, not just the promise of abstract green jobs, but what it's going to mean and what we're going to do to ensure that they really do go into your community. Otherwise, I think we can be charged, and I think Union Friends would agree with this, as just having that stated ambition, all talk without the actual policies to make that happen. And very, very briefly, I think Labour's uniquely placed to do it. We, by our history, very conscious of the need to avoid the kind of industrial change that we saw in the 1980s, really badly mismanaged. We still largely represent, and we've got to win back in some of those places, the areas of the country which are most vulnerable to the change: East and West Midlands, Yorkshire, Humber. These are the places potentially most affected if we get the transition wrong. And we've got that link with working people through the trade unions that helps us shape that. So the Just Transition Working Group is our sort of informal attempt to have a commission to think, as Alan will come on to, sector by sector, how we do this fairly.
Okay, I'll take the other Matthew. So not much pressure, just transition. What's it mean for the unions?
Yeah, well, I think I was privileged to be involved in the Paris climate change talks in 2015, and it's just worth reminding. Our main issue, sort of main cause there, was to get just transition into the legal text, and we didn't quite succeed in that, but we got it into the into the introductory paragraphs, and what it said is that the drive to achieve the climate change targets must take into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs, and that's what it says, and that's we have really failed to move that forward. And I think there are three key things. One is for workers, and I sort of represent energy workers in particular. For workers, there's a lack of confidence that in reality this is going to be the same. There's not going to be any real difference here. That people will simply be treated poorly through any transitionary process. So there needs to be confidence and meaning. The just transition has to mean something, because at the moment actually it means very little. Secondly, there's got to be proper engagement. Engagement is a challenging thing actually, because the whole issue and discussion around climate change brings about very strong opinions. But the reality is, we have to work harder to engage with workers in sectors that are key polluters, because they also have and ways forward. And if they're not listening, ready-made solutions, again, it will be genuine and real engagement, and it's not about turning up and expecting people just to fall into line. And I think the third thing is there must be a plan, and there is absolutely no plan whatsoever. And one of the great things about the Just Transition sort of task group that Labour have set up, I hope, is that we will come up with a plan. And that will be a novel thing, because the reality is, and we've seen it played out in the last week, and we see it playing out today, that if we simply allow free market forces to sort of dictate how things are going to happen, we will end up in a chaotic situation. We predicted what is happening today years ago, and so the reality is we need a plan, and a plan that delivers, and that people can have the confidence in and can own and be part of. So, I hope that's where we get to. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Matt. So, Alan, a plan that delivers.
Indeed, I just want to add two things. Firstly, we've got to be clear that the Just Transition Working Party, and indeed any Just Transition plan, has to involve not just present transition go, and think about decarbonise the energy system. What is going to happen to those left behind in the customer base and the community base, because they are not able to have access to sort of low carbon arrangements that many of us take for granted, and they may well be the people who are left high and dry in terms of bearing pretty much all the residual costs of the high carbon economy that will hang around whilst that transition is taking place. And the second thing I want to give a very brief example is actually just how witty, I would say just how jackfruity the whole business actually is, as far as Just Transition Commission thinking it's going to be. So one thing we've started on is oil and gas. Now, when we're thinking about how oil and gas transitions, then we know we've got to leave most of it in the ground. We know that there is only a residual future for oil and gas in the long term, and we also know that the present trajectory that the government is on the maximum economic, bankrupt the supply of oil in the shorter term, so that we don't have the plan for that residual supply of oil in the longer term. So how do we put together that transition in such a way as the oil industry is transitioning out, while other new industries are transitioning in, possibly in the same place, using the same infrastructure, and bringing on hydrogen economy, CCUS, the transfer of skills and jobs and opportunities in the future for similar sort of skills and jobs that would have been there in the high carbon economy and should be there in the low carbon economy, but also unionised, well paid, well supported, but being the asset for the low carbon economy that they were for the high carbon economy previously. And that does mean you're probably going to take a rather different approach towards how we deal with oil and gas for the future than you might have done if it was just a question of saying, right, close the lot down and we'll sort the mess out for the future. So is indeed both massive at the heart of that, and I do hope we can get some, however complicated it proves to be, some serious plans out in the future. So,
Okay.
yeah, my contribution. Right.
Thank you.
It's going to be fairly brief on this again.
I know, well done, Mark. So I think you've all actually articulated the challenge we've heard both from the conference floor and probably many of us who are politically engaged locally hear from workers. And I think certainly Rachel's comments today about everyday economy will actually give some encouragement, because I'm tired of hearing about high value added jobs, high tech, high manufacturing, when actually my constituents actually are really quite low skilled, low paid at the moment, and they want to transition to better lives, and they need to see that footpath. But that's my view, that's my perspective. This is about you. The floor is yours, colleagues. Whoa, first up there, red t-shirt.
Hi, I'm Charlie Hicks. I'm a county councillor in Oxford, and I'm doing a project at the moment with LSE Cities on fairness in transport, looking at the literature of fairness perceptions. And they articulate between outcome fairness and the distribution of costs and benefits. But actually, more important, or just as if not more important, they say process fairness. So, do people feel included in the process by which the decisions are made? I don't see your point about engagement. And I'm wondering, is the group looking at that element of fairness perceptions in regards to the process? And they talk about voice explanations and respectful treatment, including that citizen assemblies, citizen juries, including communities, and that sort of thing.
Okay, really important point there. So the fairness of the process as much as the outcome. I'll take that. I'm going to take them in threes, and then you guys can just select which bits you feel most equipped. Can we have the mic?
Well, I can do a mic if you like. My name's Vic Parks. I'm a nobody actually, and no one I say that, but I'm a nobody really. I'm an electrical engineer by background, heavy current. I come from a technology background. And I think we have a different view. A lot of people I've spoken to with technology backgrounds, for me, I'm deeply worried about the green agenda, because I feel, particularly for the less well-off people, and that can be quite a high percentage of the population, that they're going to be devastated. You're going to take their cars away. You're going to increase their energy prices. And, unless, I heard this, what you've just said now, and I'm encouraged by it, transition and doing it in a fair and just way. That's true. But I've just heard Sadiq Khan talking about extending the low pollution zone. Who does that hurt? The poor people, the people who got old bangers, inverted commas. They're going to take their cars away because they can't afford to be on the road. That's the start, the thin edge of the wedge. And I've been involved in politics for a long time. And, this is the way politicians work these days. They do a little bit, then they increase it, then they increase it. It's the same as like in London, you've got the congestion charge. initially it was just a few hours. Now it's all day, 24/7, you know. But my concern is I'm really concerned about ordinary people and not, you know, basically screwing them. I just finish off with this. I wrote an article a couple of years ago. A Chartist editor was going to publish it. It was called Living with Climate Change. And he was going to publish it. But then the editorial board, full of middle-class green zealots, blocked it. And there's no voice. So that's the only voice I'm getting is something like this, you know. How much difference it makes, because I'm a nobody, I don't know. But to just finish off, my concern is that we can have a nation of lords, masters, serfs, peasants, and slaves, because the green agenda suits rich people. They'll carry on flying. Poor people have green taxes and everything else. Their lives will go down. It suits the rich people as they drive through empty streets with their electric, you know, Lamborghinis or electric Bentleys, and it benefits them. They don't care paying here high, you know, £35 to park your car. They don't care, but ordinary poor old Joe Public can't. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Victor. You articulated the huge challenge that we have to deliver and address those very concerns. So thank you for amplifying that perspective. Final point to take from George, lady here.
Sorry, I am blind.
Thank you, Amelia Cartwright from Weber Shandwick. Just kind of on the oil and gas issue, I was just, obviously we've got the North Sea transition deal, and I was just wondering kind of what you see the next steps, particularly for sort of unlocking private investment into those renewable energies, so that kind of simultaneous phasing out of one and phasing in the other would be to you guys.
Okay, so I can't get that word out. So balancing the books through transition. How do we actually respond to the point of how can this be fair? And the process, how can we engage people within the process? Matt, you don't have to answer every single thing.
No, in terms of process, I mean, I covered that off, I think, in my view that, well, there's a challenge here, because I represent a group of workers who are very much in the front line of change, and that's been a change that's been going on for a few years now. We've lost, you know, quite a lot of jobs in that area, and so for me there is an immediate focus on trying to make sure that they are engaged in the solutions, and they're not at the moment. You know, the level of engagement we have is poor. Credit, as I say, the Just Transition Working Group is at least, you know, an attempt to try and bring that about. Just on the low income challenge, I have a lot of sympathy with what you say. My union has lots of low paid members working, and we've seen what's happened in the last few days with, you know, energy prices suddenly shooting up. We've seen the fragility of the system. I happen to believe, however, and I've made this point countless times, that, I mean, we focus on energy prices, but we don't focus on demand management. And things like energy efficiency, for instance, you know, if we had a proper systematic root and branch delivery of energy efficiency for everybody, and it can be done in a way which is actually no upfront cost, we would reduce consumption. We would make the poorest in our society, you know, put in a much better position. We could actually eradicate fuel poverty if we did that, and do so much more. But we choose not to as a society. In fact, and I would want the Labour Party and a future Labour government to be much bolder on that issue, because it's a win-win, and it would create the jobs across the economy in the low skilled sector, for instance. Some of that work is pretty basic, going into lofts, and, you know, we've still got millions of homes that don't have adequate loft and cavity wall insulation. So I do think that we can do a lot more to alleviate that concern. But if we don't instigate a proper plan, what we will end up with, and we have seen this with subsidies that have been given to solar, solar panels, we end up with lots of well-earned middle-class people getting the subsidies, taking the subsidies, getting the benefits. We've got people going off-grid because they can afford to go off-grid. And what we end up with is the low-income householders paying the socialised costs for everything, and picking up the tab. And that cannot be allowed to happen. And I actually think that democracy itself won't allow that to happen, because, and this is the challenge for us who argue for that balance, that we will simply end up with those policies will become unpopular, and the right will capture their votes because they will come out against climate change. They'll come out against the recognising the challenges that brings. And we already see that. We saw it in Australia in 2018. We've seen it in parts of the American electoral cycle. So we need to have a proper approach, but I do believe it can be done.
Max.
I'll pick up two of those. Charlie, I think process-wise, I mean, the whole concept of just transition has social dialogue at its heart, and that's kind of has shaped the way we've set up this working group. But I think you make a wider point, which is probably outside the remit of the group specifically. But I do think there is a role for things like citizens' juries and other means of properly engaging the public in some of these decisions, some of the trade-offs that need to happen. And I think if you do that in a smart way, you probably can build consensus. I mean, the UK Climate Assembly is a really interesting example. If you haven't seen the UK Climate Assembly, there's a very interesting documentary on it on iPlayer, and they recently came to Parliament, and these are just normal people representative of the population. The really heartening thing from that is that what came out of it is a high level of consensus for bold climate action, and and a willingness to engage with some of these things. So I do think that can be useful for controversial things like LTNs or whatever it might be, as a mechanism to build in. Just on the fairness point this gentleman articulated, and you encapsulate the problem really. And why we need to have fairness at the heart of these issues. I mean, what I would say, that ULEZ is a good example. The ultra low emission zones going through the heart of my constituency. And I think we've got to be very careful about just saying this is about taxes on working class people. Many working class communities suffer from appalling air quality off the A102 motorway. And their lives and their health are going to be improved by some of these measures. But yes, we've absolutely got to make it fair. And it's a good example of where not enough is being done. The Mayor allocated 50 million on scrappage schemes, the type of scheme that would assist people who are going to struggle to make the transition to upgrade their car to higher emission standards in this case. Yeah, and there's not enough, and he needs more support from central government to do it. So it's a good example of, yes, you articulate the problem, but I'd say we've got to be very careful, as Matthew said. There is, I don't know if it's got a label yet, but Steve Baker's latest research group, it's no doubt called a research group of some form. But this is where the right is going to come at this, to try and delay and stifle climate action by pressing on cost. And we've got to have a response to that. And it's got to be, whether it's interest-free loans for EVs, whether it's ways to make heat pumps affordable for those on the sharp end. That's the central challenge to this, is how do we make this affordable and fair going forward? And that's very much at the heart of why we set this up and our thinking.
Okay, so the fair and affordable challenge. You made a really good point at a session I was in earlier, Alan, about the government needing to do the jobs better and us having to prove that we can give the jobs from the process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's big, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Right.
I think one of your points particularly could be encapsulated by what is happening at the moment with the way the government organises the socialisation of distribution costs on electricity, which is that everything on the costs of the distribution companies distributing the system fall on bills in the end. There's a process whereby they are given an amount of money to invest, and quite unbelievably, the government gives the distribution companies money to invest, which they then put on our bills, and they keep the proceeds on their balance sheets at the end of the process. However, as the low carbon economy progresses, then the system of that distribution cost will fall very differently on people. And quite a lot of people will be on either individual off-grid arrangements or on private grids, or on local grids, and guess who will remain on the distributed grid and will have all those costs heaped upon them, which is the poorest and least able to to access low carbon economy at all. And they will eventually, if the present system huge money and pathway carbon system, which is a good for all of us. Systems it's got to be a part of a just transition, because otherwise we know who's going to pay. Now, as far as oil and gas is concerned, the oil and gas transition deal is not a transition deal. What it does is it asks the oil and gas industry to do one or two things which are rather obvious about how they conduct their business on flaring and on electrification of offshore devices. But it keeps the maximum economic recovery still going. It doesn't deal with the question of production at all. And it means that it's only actually dealing with about 8-9% of what the emissions of the oil and gas industry are really about. And we can't stop there. We can't have that kind of arrangement as our supposed net zero deal as far as oil and gas is concerned. So we've got to deal with it in an entirely different way. And that's where what Matthew's been saying about both Matthews, about how the workforce is involved in this, what sort of practices we need to bring in, how we actually deal with, for example, the North Sea as an overseas, as an overall basin, in order to plan that deal, all of which at present are completely beyond the reach of government schemes in place.
Colleague there, and the colleague there. So if we can take these two first. Two women at the front. The woman in green jacket here, woman in leather jacket there, woman in the corner. I just thought the women needed a amplifying as well.
Abby Kay, Farmers Guardian magazine. It's funny you should mention jackfruit because I want to ask a little bit about meat. Where do you envisage livestock farmers ending up in 30 years' time? Are you expecting them to change jobs? Because when I speak to them, they're very clear that they don't want to be termed park keepers. They want to carry on producing food. Their identity is bound up in that. So how do you manage a just transition for them?
Sorry, who was the second one? Sorry.
Second one's there. There, one's by the door.
Sorry, me again, sorry. Yeah, I really get this. I really appreciate it. I really support it. I've been environmentalist for a long time, but I vote Labour because I know you will get stuff done that will have an impact. I don't vote Green because I know they won't. They won't do it. But I get embarrassed because I go to these like really nice webinars run by Greens, and they're all kind of talking the same language. It's very elite. And I just worry that my neighbour, for example, she's left Brighton. We live in Brighton, nice bit of Brighton. She's left Brighton because she's worried about the low traffic neighbourhood, and she's disabled and she has to drive. And she's like, this is not the place for me anymore. So she's left Brighton. Green councillor, Green MP. That is really shocking, and it's very emblematic of how the Greens have been acting in Brighton. Also, taxi drivers say to me, oh my goodness, you're going to be in that low traffic neighbourhood, aren't you? You know, that's really shocking. Nobody's asked us about this. This is going to be a nightmare, all these one-way streets. So I do totally get that this is a bit out of your remit because it's not unionised labour. I talk to builders in the pub. I'm actually the only person in the Labour Party that actually goes to builders' pubs and have a chat with people. And they don't know anything about greening homes and the fact you can put this lovely cork at the back because they're not traditional Labour voters. They're not unionised. They run their own little businesses. They don't know anything about this obvious stuff that needs to get communicated. So is there a point when we could talk to builders, they could be stakeholders, we could talk to non-unionised taxi drivers, because do you know what, they are going to vote Tory and then this is all going to slow down. And the other thing, I'd just like to make a really quick point about women and the fact that the green revolution generally is going to put a massive onus on women. I peg out the clothes and, you know, get on the bus and chop all my vegetables, but that is a massive amount of labour, and we do all the unpaid labour anyway. We're not unionised. I can't go on strike with my children. You know, I just want you to have a think about who is going to vote Labour or Green in the future, because it looks worrying to me. We don't want to look really elite and out of touch with the majority. Sorry.
Thank you for that. And again, to echo a point, I bear the scars of low traffic neighbourhoods, and I think some of us could write a book of the lessons we need to learn from their implementation. But clearly one that was affected in my ward was care workers trying to get about. But again, it comes back to the government putting forward a policy without the money, because actually there wasn't the money for the taxi drivers to do the screening schemes. Lady there.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Voice up, okay. I'm here as my CLP delegate. That's why I'm here. No, nothing. Well, obviously nothing. My worries or concerns are because I work with deaf young people, voluntarily, obviously, my age. Deaf young people, as most young people, working class or with poor education, are not finding jobs. Now, you're talking about green jobs. You've just mentioned solar energy, and people putting solar panels up. Now, why aren't we sort of creating courses at further education level, so that they, you know, deaf and hearing young people can start to learn to work in the green economy? That's one very important step forward, I would have thought. The other issue is recycling. I mean, I've got passion about this. I look at people who don't recycle properly. Why aren't we promoting it properly? Most people don't know how to do it, you know. The other thing, of course, is councils seem to have a standard policy on recycling. The one council would be better than another. I'm from Wakefield, which I've been told, I've had a look around the recycling centre, been told is an advanced one, but it's still working with racks and biomass. Is biomass wood pellets, or is it actual recycling? I mean, there's so many questions I wanted to ask. And what about electricity? Are we going to have to use nuclear energy? That's got a lot of repercussions. I think that'll do. Yes, there's a lot more questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think, again, what was reflected in a number of those points was actually the reality of the lived experience. And then the other really important point was actually this isn't just about urban areas. This is very much I think it's been decided, Alan, that you're answering the two principal points of that, and then I'll ask Matthew to take the round.
Yeah, I mean, the question of rural agriculture is one thing actually we will be coming to in the transition working party. This is something I would say is this party policy, not something that should go. What will happen over the next 20 years is that most of those people who are farming livestock will not be farming livestock. That doesn't mean they're not farming anything. And if we have a chaotic transition away from livestock farming, well, two things. If we have a transition away from livestock farming, but we don't have a very careful transition in the rural and agricultural economy to various other forms of farming, and things like land stewardship and farming of negative products and all things like that, then actually we will have a chaotic retreat in the agricultural industry as a result of changes. But I mean, in a way, saying, you know, some people saying, right, I'm a livestock farmer and I want to farm livestock forever, is a bit like, you know, people in workers in coal-fired power stations saying, I've always been a coal-fired power station worker. I want to be in a coal-fired power station forever. Therefore, you've got to organise it so we always have coal-fired power stations. We can't do that. It's not. Yeah, it's not possible to do that, and nor should we ever think of doing that because of net zero imperatives. And it's the same thing in terms of livestock farming, I'm afraid. But that, precisely this point about Just Transition Commission that we're getting to at the moment is you do not make those changes by leaving the people who were in the previous economy behind, and you certainly don't make those changes without using all the skills and knowledge and understanding and objectivity of those people who were in the previous economy to transition to the new economy. And that's exactly what we've got to do as far as agriculture and land use is concerned for the future. And we've got to do that pretty quickly because agriculture and land use is, I think, about 11-12% of emissions. And if we don't make those changes, will remain that and become an ever increasing part of emissions in the overall scheme of things.
Okay.
So
Briefly,
no,
sorry, because amplifying voices and hearing too many voices. And waste, briefly.
Yeah, waste. Well, I mean, Drax is was one of the biggest coal-fired power stations in the country, and it was responsible for about 7% of our total power. So it's a huge business employing coal in its production uniquely. Now, Drax has almost entirely now converted over to biomass. And the question of biomass is what the overall emissions of biomass are, depending on where you get your biomass from and how you manage to use it. And Drax, personally, I think, is actually too big in the future to use biomass as well as we might want it, because at the moment they're importing quite a lot of biomass from overseas, and we've got a question about how sustainable that biomass from overseas is, even though the transportation costs are not very high. Ideally, what you want for biomass, and indeed negative biomass producers, which is biomass with CCUS, is actually sourcing all that stuff from the area around, and that actually brings us into the trees agenda, believe it or not, which is that if we really are planting, as we should do, something like 2.4 billion trees over the next 30 or 40 years to get us to the forest cover of 20% that we need in this country. Then alongside that, we've got an enormous amount of forestry and rural industry with it, which will include things like forest trimmings, thinnings and various other things, all of which can be properly and successfully used in relatively large-scale biomass industries. So Drax is in a sort of biomass transition period, but it doesn't mean that it hasn't got a role in the future, because it certainly has, in terms of how we use that biomass that we're going to produce in this country for the future, sustaining those industries as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up the point around the narrative and around, essentially speaking the language of ordinary people in terms of respect to the changes that need to be made. I do believe very passionately there is a very compelling case that would resonate with people around the drive to net zero, but it can easily fall off the cliff, frankly, and the danger is that it will be seen as elitist, and it will be seen as compartmentalized in different groups with people receiving the messages in different ways. Part of the problem, as I see it, is that we just haven't identified how we're going to do things and then take them forward in a cohesive way. I don't know what's happened to this country in regards to the way we plan and deliver energy, for instance. But in the 1960s, when we discovered North Sea gas, we transformed the whole nation from town gas to methane gas. and we did it systematically with largely popular support. And we did it, and if you look into that program of activity that took place, it was absolutely end-to-end, totally end-to-end. We built the first civil nuclear engineering to generate power in the world. We could achieve these things, and people saw it as, a civilizing thing, and ordinary working people were employed to drive this forward, and it created thousands of jobs. I've still got members who were employed in apprenticeship schemes to go from town gas to methane gas. And we need to come up with a similar narrative and a plan, not just to make every home energy efficient, but to pay for it as well, and to alleviate any fear or burden that might come from that. Builders, this is 300,000-400,000 workers being gainfully employed, doing good things, over many, many years. But we have to have some vision, and we have to have a plan that can actually take people with them. Because we're arguing about that, and we can argue about Drax till the cows come home, but it's a start. It's already decarbonising. We're not going to get the perfect solutions, and if we strive only for the perfect things, we'll fall a long way short. So I do think we need to have a plan, and we have to have a plan that really captures people's imagination and takes them along. Because we'll be buffeted on the way.
Okay, we are desperately running out of time. Matt, you've heard a range of perspectives from what's been said. What's your take on it, and what would you take forward back into the Just Transition Working Group from what you've heard from the floor today?
I mean, I've heard some really interesting contributions, and very much take the point. Lots of the concerns you've outlined are the things we're wrestling with. I suppose just in summing up, I'll pick up the point the lady made. I think we've got to be very clear, and we're trying to be, about what we mean when we say green jobs. And it doesn't just mean manufacturing jobs. I very much take the point there are lots of jobs in the foundational economy which are green. Shouldn't be excluded from that. But I just think we have to have a very definite sense, whether we're talking about regions of the country or different nations, what we mean when we say, for example, you shouldn't have a deep coal mine opened in Cumbria, but here are precisely the type of green, low carbon jobs we see you as being able to secure over the years ahead, rather than some abstract promise. I do think, just pick up on another point someone said, that does mean skills, and that does mean training and retraining. It touches on Matt's point in that, we don't have, I refuse to call the government's 10-point package 10-point plan, because it isn't a plan. And there is no plan in lots of these areas, whether it's heat and buildings, whether it's electric vehicles, for example. I mean, that electric vehicle target is not in legislation. It's an important signal. There's no plan as to how we get there, how we put the infrastructure in place. So we've got to do this. And if we're going to, in particular, bear down on energy efficiency and decarbonising residential and commercial properties, we've got to upskill the workforce to be able to do that. It's just nowhere near, and that's partly why the Green Homes grant fell over. I mean, there was one supplier, I think, in London that could do the full home retrofit in the way that people wanted. And I'll finish on this point, is I think, I've said this a couple of times today, or doing myself out of a shadow role ultimately. I think there's a real machinery of government point here, which is, I don't think BEIS can drive this agenda on its own. I'd ideally put it in number 10 on the Cabinet Office. I think you've got to have net zero strung across every government department so that everything is joined up. And skills is a good example, education, transport, housing, whatever it might be. And we're not getting that at the moment from the government. We're not getting the strategies. We're not getting that whole of government approach where it really does run through everything that every department's doing, and in particular, everything the Treasury spends money on.
Thank you, colleagues, for that, and thank you for the contributions from the audience. I really wish we could have carried on debating this for, I'm sure we could have actually carried on debating it for several hours. I think what we've heard is the importance of owning the challenge and actually recognising that we all have to change, including politicians. And from that, we have to be honest. We have to be honest. This is not going to be easy, and we've got to actually understand where we're going. And from that, really picking up on Matt's point, Unison's point, we do need a plan, and a plan that actually can take us all with it. So thank you, colleagues, very much for coming. There's a rally in here shortly. Hopefully we'll see you throughout conference. And CERA is a membership organisation. Please join CERA. This is a debate that we need to have. It's a debate that we need to have that actually draws on lived context. So join CERA and help us have it. Thank you.
Thank you.